Welcome to today's webinar,
Maureen Morrell,
Building
University of
Bridges to
Notre
Belonging
Dame.
in STEM Mindsets that Increase Participation, Achievement, and Learning in the Face of Stereotypes with Catherine Good. My name is Greg Nagy, and I'm the Virtual Learning Community Manager from The Ohio State University who provides technical support for the STEM Equity Pipeline Project. Before we start the presentation, I would like to go over some housekeeping items for this webinar. This webinar is scheduled to last roughly 1 hour and 30 minutes and is being recorded in order to view this presentation in its entirety later. The recorded webinar will be available in the next few days on the stemequitypipeline.org website. As you've already found out, you'll be watching the presenter present slides through the Adobe Connect interface while listening to her talk over your computer speakers or your phone. You'll also be able to interact with the speaker with polls in the chat pod. All the participants' microphones have been automatically muted. If you're using your phone, please remember to mute your phone by typing *6. You can also download resources from the Files pod. Click on the file you want to download and then click the Download Files button. This will open the file as a link in a different tab in your browser. The presenter will answer questions after the presentation. However, we can take questions at any time. This is how we take questions. At any time during the presentation, you may submit a question by typing your question in the chat pod at the bottom of your Adobe Connect window. We will read and respond to those questions at the end of the presentation. I'd like to start the webinar by introducing Freda Walker, consultant for the STEM Equity Pipeline Project. Freda? Freda, can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, there you go.
Okay. Thank you and welcome. We are pleased to have the webinar today, Building Bridges to Belonging in STEM, Mindsets that Increase Participation, Achievement, and Learning in the Face of Stereotypes.
Andrea Beard.
I can hear people getting on, so I'm just waiting a second or two, and I'm going to ask anyone who's getting on by phone if they'll make sure that they hit *6 to mute their phones. Thank you.
This is Sally Daniel from Tidewater Community College. And
please hit *6 to mute your phone. Thank you, Sally.
And Betsy Fauché also from Tidewater.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Let's continue here. I'd like to start by doing a few polls, and some of you actually started answering these when we were waiting and everyone is signing on. And so I'd like to, let's see, Greg, I am looking for the polls now. Thank you. And we can broadcast this as we can ask people to see how many people have answered. So can everyone see that that it's broadcast? Greg, you may have to broadcast for me.
There, it's going now.
Okay, thank you. There we go. People are answering. I can see that most people still are coming on from the STEM Equity Pipeline mail list. We still have people that are from colleagues. We appreciate those colleagues that are forwarding on. Let's move to our next poll. We'd like to know who's participating, and already I know that many people have been chatting and telling us who they are, so I appreciate that. And let's see, Greg. Let's see.
You going to switch it, Freda, or you want me to?
I am. I'm getting ready to switch it.
Okay, there you go.
Here we go. And this will just give us an idea of the makeup of our audience today. So if you can answer. Am I getting close to 109 people on? We had a large sign up today, so it's wonderful. You can see that we have, we have a pretty good distribution between school and college administrators, faculty, and counselors, and also some other staff. So thank you. we'd like to know if there's anyone watching with you, if you're watching by yourself, and can indicate how many people are watching with you. If there are more than 5 people, please indicate that in the chat function for me. So we can see we have a few extra people that are watching besides the one that are registered. Thank you. Right now we were just asking about what your expectations were for the, I've got to go back one. So I don't have, I guess, a slide for this, but if you might just, those of you would like to answer and like to see what other people, why they're on, and also, Catherine, you can start to look at the different answers of what people are looking for today. And I think that you're going to be very pleased with the information content that Catherine will present and also with the strategies that she will share with you. Okay, we've got a big selection, so just you can keep answering if you want to answer in the chat function. I'm going to end the poll now. But gosh, I'm just looking latest trends. You're going to hear some of the latest trends. You're going to hear some strategies to persist when there are stereotypes occurring. Okay, thank you. I'd like to share that the funding for these webinars is through NAEP, the National Alliance for Partnerships and Equity, and also through a grant by the National Science Foundation, so we appreciate their support. We have archived webinars on our STEMequitypipeline.org website, so please be sure and go there. Also, if you would like to have a certificate of completion from this webinar, at the very end of the webinar, there's an opportunity to fill out a survey, and at the end of that survey, you can click and get a certificate of completion to download for yourself and fill in your name. We have resource documents, and the resource documents are available today, and you'll see right in the middle, I just clicked onto a new presentation. You'll see there's a resource handout, and if you highlight that, then you can download it to your computer. It contains contact with our speaker, Catherine Good. It also contains resources for you to look at, and a website that she believes is a very good one for you to look at, Reducing Stereotype Thread. .org, and it also has a variety of publications that she will reference during her presentation, and some that would just be good reading. So please highlight that and download it to your computer. We have a chat function, and this group is already very talented in using it. I appreciate all the information that you're sharing, so just continue to do so. We take formal questions at the end, but Catherine will be having questions that she questions or responses that she would like to have from you, and we'd like for you to do that in the chat function. So I'm ready to introduce Dr. Catherine Good. She's an associate professor of psychology. I consider her to be an expert in the area of stereotype threat, and she's going to provide us with some new research and remind us of some concepts that some of us are familiar with, and also provide strategies that we can implement. So, Catherine, you're on.
Thank you so much, Freda. I'm very happy to be here today, and I'd like to start by presenting a quote from one of my favorite scientists. This is Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson. You may recognize him as the director of the Hayden Planetarium here in New York City. When he graduated with his PhD in astrophysics in 2001, I believe it was, he became one of only 4 African-American astrophysicists out of more than 7,000 nationwide. He gave the convocation address at Columbia University, and he noted the following about his academic trajectory. In the perception of society, my athletic talents are genetic. I am a likely mugger rapist. My academic failures are expected, and my academic successes are attributed to others. To spend most of my life fighting these attitudes levies an emotional tax that is a form of intellectual emasculation. This emotional tax that Dr. Degrassi Tyson is referring to references the burden he felt of being an African American male trying to pursue a science field and the expectations that were placed on him because of his race. Now, you may argue that stereotypes about racial groups may have gone underground, that they may be more implicitly stated rather than explicitly stated, and that gender stereotypes, however, are often more likely to be explicitly expressed. And as an example of that, I want to share with you a quote from, I got to use my navigation tools here, from a quote from Dr. Larry Summers. Dr. Summers was the president of Harvard University, and he was the lunchtime speaker at a conference, the purpose of which was to better understand how to diversify the science and engineering workforce. And he hypothesized about why so few females were represented at the highest levels of achievement in STEM. One reason that he gave was, and is come to be known as the different availability of aptitude at the high end hypothesis. And what he meant by this was that when you look at the very highest achievers in STEM, that men are inherently smarter than women. What Dr. Summers did was he breathed new life into the age-old stereotype that women are not capable in mathematics compared to their male peers. And I would argue that he levied this emotional tax on the female students at Harvard and in fact nationwide by making these comments. This emotional tax, the intellectual emasculation, and the situation that I think Dr. Summers and others like him who may express these views perhaps set up has been studied in psychology and is known as stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is the apprehension that can arise when you are aware that a negative ability stereotype about your group exists, and you find yourself in a situation in which that stereotype is relevant and therefore perhaps confirmable. I want to share with you the very first study that was done on this effect, just so that we have a foundation for some of the work that I will present throughout the rest of the presentation. Claude Steele and Josh Aronson had Black and white students from Stanford University come into the lab and take a very difficult verbal test. For half of the students, they presented the test as something that would be a measure of their underlying intellectual ability. And what they found was the typical gap in achievement between Black and white students that persists across almost all levels of schooling and across all levels of socioeconomic backgrounds as well. That is, that Black students underperformed compared to their white peers. For the other half of the participants, they gave them the same test in the same amount of time, but they framed it slightly differently. Instead of suggesting that their performance on the test might be indicative of their underlying ability, they told them that they were just psychologists who were interested in problem-solving skills, and that it was not related to underlying achievement or ability. And what they found in this condition, when they just changed the framing of what the purpose of the test was, when they decoupled it from having anything to do with the participants' underlying intellect, the gap in achievement between Black and white students went away. Claude and Josh hypothesized that this might have something to do with the negative stereotype that Black students have to contend with. So they ran another study to see if they could get any evidence to this. They had participants come back into the lab. They said, for half of them, we're going to give you a verbal test that will tell us how smart you are. Another group, they said, we're going to give you some verbal problems to solve. It has nothing to do with intellectual ability. But before you start working on this test, we'd like you to complete this word fragment task for us. Please complete these words with letters that would make real words. And I'd like you to do that now. If you could please complete, use the chat function if you like. See if you can fill in the blanks to complete a word for each one. And I'll just pause here for a second while you do that. See lots of words flying by as people are completing this task as if they were participants in Josh and Claude's study. And I'll just start going through these. So the first word, you could complete it with the word face, F-A-C-E. But you could also complete it with the word race, R-A-C-E. The next one might be smack or crack or black. The third one could be lace or lazy. The fourth one might be something like door or pour. And finally, the last one could be completed with something like close, class. What do you notice about the different types of words that we listed here, both in the chat function and as I suggested? Does anybody notice any patterns that might have emerged? So I'm seeing things like that some of the words were negative, that they were some adjectives, but also you may have noticed that every one of these words could be completed with a very sort of innocuous word like face, but every word could also be completed with a race relevant word, something that had to do with the stereotype of African Americans in our culture. And what they found was that depending on which condition you were in, whether or not you thought you were about to take a diagnostic test or not, had everything to do with whether or not you completed these words with race-relevant words or non-race relevant words. And as you can see from the graph here, the hashed bars represent the white participants, and the different framing of the tasks that they thought that they were about to do had no impact on how they completed these words. The solid bars represent the black students, and you'll notice a few things. First of all, black students were much more likely to complete these words with race-relevant words, but particularly when they thought that they were about to take a diagnostic test. So there's something about the idea that I'm about to take a test, my ability is on the line. It brings with it a whole host of stereotypes about your group. It brings it to mind, it makes them readily available to you. And what researchers have found is that this predicament of having to take a test, you think that your ability is on the line, brings with it the stereotypes that this might be what might be driving some of these underperformance effects that we have been finding in the laboratory. Stereotype threat is not something that is just relevant to the laboratory setting. It can also be experienced in the classroom. We went into calculus classes. This was the third semester calculus class for those who were in the science sequence, so they were taking Calc 1, 2, and 3 in college. These are our future scientists and engineers. For half of the students, we told them that the performance on the test that we were about to give them would be indicative of their underlying math intelligence. And what we found in this condition, otherwise known as the stereotype threat condition, is that males and females did equally well. So despite what Dr. Summers suggested, men and women can compete at very high levels in mathematics. But what was interesting to us is that when they took the exact same calculus test, we're talking about triple integration problems here, but we framed the test as something that was not related to underlying ability. And in fact, we went on to say that men and women have equal chances of doing well on this test, that the women significantly outperformed the men. What's also notable here is that when we looked at participants' grades, we looked at their final course grades that they earned in the class, those grades modeled what we see in the stereotype threat condition. That is, that men and women earned equal grades. This suggests not only can women compete with men in those classes, but also stereotype threat might be operating within their own classroom environment to suppress their classroom grades. If you can get rid of the threat, make their performance in the class uncoupled to underlying ability, dispel the stereotypes, that perhaps that can allow females to unleash the potential and actually outperform the males. So what we know from over a decade of research is that stereotype threat can impact almost anybody who faces a negative stereotype about their abilities in a particular domain. It can impact females taking math tests, even young girls as young as 6th grade as they begin to start middle school. It can affect Latinos taking verbal tests, students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. It can even undermine Black students who are engaged in a miniature golf task when they've been told that how well they do on the putt-putting task is indicative of their underlying intellectual ability. And what this study shows us is that these stereotype threat effects can transfer to a domain in which there is no stereotype, in fact, but just the intellectual stereotype might be connected. We can even show underperformance by white males who we could argue face very few stereotypes about their intellectual ability when they take a math test, when they first think that the purpose of the test is to better understand why Asians are so superior. What this test shows us is that stereotype threat is not something that is internal to the individuals. This is not a deficit model theory, that it's something that we carry around with us because of a history of negative stereotyping, but rather that it's a situational predicament. When I'm in a situation in which the stereotype is relevant to me, and therefore I'm at risk of confirming it, that's when my performance is most vulnerable. So what about learning? We know that stereotype threat can undermine performance on a task, but given what we know about the stereotype threat construct, in what ways might you think that stereotype threat could undermine the learning process? I'll just give you a few moments. If you have some ideas, you can type that in the chat function. Okay, so I see people saying things like perhaps students won't try hard. It may decrease their concentration and motivation. It might be a self-fulfilling prophecy. You might feel like you don't belong in the class. You might not engage in your learning. Perhaps you even have low expectations for yourself. So we are going to touch on almost all of these concepts that you put into this chat function here. So I want to share with you a study that I did with my colleagues at Columbia University, where we were trying to better understand the emotional correlation between stereotype threat and learning. What we did here was we had female participants come into the lab. We gave them a math test under stereotype threat or non-threat condition, and they solved problems with an EEG recording. So what we mean by that is that we're looking at their brainwave responses to negative feedback that they're getting on each individual problem as they indicate their answer. So they indicate an answer, they're told if they get the problem right or wrong, and we're recording their responses that they have to that negative feedback. The particular EEG recordings that we're going to discuss here are the FRN. This is an automatic appraisal of the feedback valence. So here you're sort of orienting to the idea that, oh my gosh, I got feedback. Is that good or bad? The other one we're going to look at is the P3A. This has been related to sort of a focus on the feedback. Oh my gosh, I just got negative feedback about something. And finally, the LPP, the late positive potential. This is a sustained attentional arousal process. And we're going to look at how each of these, the automatic appraisal of the feedback, the orienting to the feedback, and the sustained attentional process might interfere with the learning process under both stereotype threat and non-threat. So I want to give you a sense of what the math task was because it will come up again later in the presentation as well. So they solved math problems on the computer. Each problem was presented like this. They were given a very short amount of time to complete the problems. They would indicate their answer. They would then get performance feedback, either a red asterisk in a low tone, bonk, if they got the problem wrong, a green asterisk in a higher tone, ding, if they got the problem right. At this point is when we start recording their brainwaves. After they get the performance feedback, they are given feedback about what is the correct answer, learning feedback. But as we all know, knowing that the answer to this volume problem is 6,400 doesn't help me solve the problem if I happen to get it wrong. So next, they're entered into a math tutor. Within this math tutor environment, they could hit the yellow arrow at the bottom and move on to the next problem immediately, or they could choose to spend time here and actually get some information about how they could rectify their errors. They could click on step 1, step 2, step 3. Each of these steps would give them sort of a high-level outline of how they could solve the problem. If they weren't sure how to carry out that step, they could click on the More button, as you see there, where they would be given more information. So perhaps the figure would be labeled, they might be provided with a formula of some sort, and all the while they're interacting in this learning engagement environment, we are recording how many steps they're clicking on, how many mores they're clicking on, and how much time they're spending within this learning environment. This is our measure of learning engagement. What we found was that there were different paths to learning for those who did this math task under stereotype threat and non-threat. For those under stereotype threat, they really were driven by what we call a performance focus. Learning was undermined by the emotional response to signs of poor ability. So in other words, when they got the problem wrong, they had an emotional response. Nobody likes to get a problem wrong, but that this emotional response got in the way. Second of all, what we found was that how well they were able to correct their errors. They came back a day later and took a surprise retest so that we could really see how much this learning environment helped them correct their errors and learn from their mistakes. How much they learned and how much they could correct their errors was highly predicted by their SAT scores. Those in the non-threat condition, however, had more of a process focus. Although they had an emotional response to getting a problem wrong, nobody likes to get problems wrong, but those emotional responses were less coupled to their engagement and to their ultimate learning. Second of all, how much they were able to learn was unrelated to math SAT scores. And we can talk about what that might mean later, but what I would argue is that the SAT might have some stereotype threat effects built in, so therefore it's not surprising that it might have been predictive of learning under the threat condition, but not under the non-threat condition. So I want to show you, that's sort of the take-home message, but I want to show you the data here. So this is what we did. We put all this data into a model. First, we looked at the EEG responses. This is the emotional response to that error feedback. Then we looked to see how much those emotional responses were predictive of their engagement in our learning environment that we created, and ultimately how much that might have predicted actual learning. That is, how many problems they were able to get right at the second test when they came back a day later. What we found was that emotion gets in the way of learning in two distinct ways when you are trying to learn under stereotype threat. The first is what we call a vigilance avoidance response. The FRN and the P3A both were predictive of less tutor use. So in other words, the more you were sort of orienting to the fact that you got negative feedback and appraising that feedback as negative, the less you used the tutor, the less you actually clicked around in those steps and the mores. What's unfortunate for those people was that the extent that they used the tutor was actually positively related to error correction. In other words, the more I use the tutor, the more I use my learning environment, not surprisingly, the more I learn. However, under stereotype threat, this emotional response makes that negative feedback meaningful. Perhaps it gives the suggestion that, oh my gosh, I got something wrong now. I am stereotyped not to be capable in this domain. It makes me avoid learning opportunities when they're presented to me, and ultimately to suffer in my learning outcomes. The second way that stereotype threat can get in the way of learning is through a rumination process. The third brainwave that we're going to be looking at is the LP3. This is that sustained attention process. And what we found here was that to the extent that participants had sort of this sustained arousal to the negative feedback, that was directly related to poor error correction. And what's interesting here is that the tutor had nothing to do with their learning. The best way to think about this is if you've ever been reading a book, perhaps late at night, and you find that you've read 2 or 3 pages, perhaps something happened during the day and you're very distracted and you're thinking about that thing that occurred, you don't remember necessarily what you just read. So you're engaged in the learning opportunity, but that learning opportunity is not helpful for you because you might be thinking about other things. So for those under stereotype threat, when you get negative feedback, you can have an emotional response that makes your learning opportunity ineffective. You might be engaged in learning, but you're not really deeply processing, or perhaps you're not engaging at all. It just became irrelevant. So the take-home message here is that under stereotype threat, learning can be impacted through two separate paths. One is that it makes students pull away from actually engaging in the learning opportunity. And second, it can make them, for those who do engage in the learning opportunity, it can make that learning opportunity ineffective. Under non-threat, we found a very different model. Again, we looked at the emotional response to negative feedback to see whether or not that was predictive of their use of the learning environment and ultimately if that helped them correct their errors. And what we found was that under non-threat, only the depth of the tutor use was predictive of learning. Even Math SCT was no longer predictive for these participants. So the model that arises here is that I may have an emotional response to the negative feedback. I'm focused on it, I'm orienting to it, I might even have some sustained arousal, but that emotional response is manageable. It doesn't mean as much to me because I know that my poor performance on this problem may not say anything about me as a person, me as a woman, me as an African American student, or anything about my future abilities. And I'm able to get right back to the task of learning and paying attention and being an effective learner. So our key takeaway points so far is that stereotype threat can undermine both performance on a task, but also learning. And it can do this in both the laboratory setting and in real classrooms. It can also impact anybody who faces a negative stereotype about their intellectual abilities. It's not something that is just relevant to those who are sort of chronic targets of negative stereotypes, that the situation in which we place our students has very much to do with whether or not they're going to experience threat or not. So that leads us to our question, how can we help students reduce their vulnerability to stereotype threat? So I'd like you to play along with me here. We're going to do a little math game. Imagine that you are a STEM teacher and you have a student who's just done pretty poorly on a math test. I want you to complete this equation for me. What % of the student's grade on the test was due to a lack of hard work? And what % was due to lack of math intelligence? If you could just enter that into the chat functions and make sure that your equation equals 100%. So I'm looking through here. We have some who are about 50-50. Others are really more heavily weighted on the % hard work versus % intelligence. People are still typing here. I've seen everything from 50-50 to 100% hard work, 0% intelligence. 15% lack of hard work, 85% lack of intelligence. So what we can see is that ratings are really all over the map depending on who you ask. And you may be wondering why this is relevant. You know, why does it matter what a teacher might think about why a student would do poorly or not do poorly? I'm going to show you now some data that comes out of a colleague's lab. And what they are beginning to find is that when you look at an academic field and you ask the people in that field, what is really the determinant of who does well in your domain? What predicts success? Is it hard work or is it underlying intelligence? Field-specific ability beliefs. So whether or not the people in the field believe that success is driven by ability, underlying intelligence, is strongly correlated to an underrepresentation of females in that field. So the graph I'm showing you here is the % of female PhDs in various fields across the STEM disciplines, plotted against the extent to which people in that field believe that success is determined by underlying intelligence. And what you can see is that there is a strong negative correlation, meaning that the more a field has this culture of talent around it, the less women are going to be represented in that field. This is also true not just of STEM, but in humanities as well. I could show you a graph that represents this is almost exact line looking at things like philosophy and English, the humanities, and it's the same idea. The more a field is oriented towards talent, the less women are going to be represented in that field. So beliefs about what drives success are very important for underrepresentation, for predicting who might be relevant and who might be represented in a field. And those ideas are communicated to students. So the negative stereotype, here's one model we can think about how stereotype threat really leads to underperformance. It raises questions about ability. Are you capable? because of your race, because of your gender, maybe you're not. And when questions of ability are raised, that can lead to underperformance. So this is one path through which the negative stereotype leads to underperformance, but it also gives us a point of intervention. If we could focus on and reframe what it means to be smart, what it means to be capable, perhaps we can disrupt this path from the negative stereotype to underperformance. This work comes out of Carol Dweck's long history of work on implicit theories of intelligence, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. It's beginning to receive a lot of popular press about mindsets about ability. And I'll just go through it very briefly for you. In Carol's work, she classifies people into one of two categories, either entity theorists or incremental theorists. Entity theorists tend to believe that intelligence is fixed. It's a trait that's largely determined by nature. Incremental theorists, on the other hand, endorse the idea that intelligence is a malleable quality that can be increased through nurture, through hard work and effort. Both of these types of thinkers desire similar outcomes. They want to do well, they want to get a good grade, they want to have high scores, but they have very different motivations for why they want that good grade, why they want to get a good score on an assignment or on an assessment. For entity theorists, their goal is to validate their ability. If I'm somebody who thinks of intelligence as fixed, I really hope to show through my performance that I am one of those people, that I am somebody with the requisite amount of intelligence. I tend to agree with statements like the following. The main thing I want when I do my schoolwork is to show how good I am at it. Because showing how good I am reflects more than just my performance on this one task, but it says something about my underlying ability that's rooted in my nature, and it's fixed. Incremental theorists, on the other hand, pursue what we call learning goals. Their goal is to develop their ability. They tend to agree with statements like the following. In school, I am always seeking opportunities to develop new skills and acquire new knowledge. Now you can imagine that if you have students in your classroom with these two different views, they might have very different responses, both to hard work, to struggle, to difficulties, to failure, for example. And this is exactly what Carol and her colleagues have found across a number of studies. In short, entity theorists' goal is to look smart, even if that means sacrifices opportunities for learning. As we know, learning really occurs in that space where you're pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone. As Vygotsky would say, we need to live in the zone of proximal development. Well, that's risky because it means that I might fail, I might struggle. Entity theorists are less likely to choose tasks that live in that space. For them, failure is a sign of low intelligence. If I have to put effort into my work, that means that I'm not smart. If I'm smart because of my nature, then I should be able to perform well without too much effort. After I encounter difficulty, I'm less likely to continue to put in hard work, and I'm more likely to have impaired performance moving forward. For incremental theorists, on the other hand, their goal is to learn new things, even if that means that they risk underperformance if it's risky or hard for them. For them, failure does not mean that they're not capable. It just means that they didn't put in enough effort, or as I like to say, they didn't put in effective effort. They didn't put in the right kinds of study strategies for the task. And it cues for them the idea that they need to make a change. They need to change the way they're studying, ask more questions, reach out to the instructor, get a tutor, whatever that might be. So how does this relate to stereotype threat? You can imagine that if you are, let's say, female, taking a very difficult math test, and you've just heard the news that Larry Summers thinks that females are not as capable as men at high-level math tasks, that you might temporarily be placed into that entity theory framework. Those stereotypes suggest that because of your race, because of your gender, you are inherently limited, that your abilities are determined by your genes. And that might bring with it the whole host of negative outcomes that we see through Carol Dweck's work that are related to that entity theory framework. If, on the other hand, we can encourage participants to embrace the malleable view of intelligence, to think of it as something that can be increased with hard work and effort, we might protect them from that entity view that the stereotype sort of carries with it and enable them to have the outcomes that we see from incremental theorists. And this is exactly what we have done in a number of studies with both college students and with middle school students. We've gone into intact classrooms, working with students in schools as well as in the laboratory. But the take-home message here is that we teach them a little neuroscience. We teach them what a neuron is, what dendrites are, what a synapse is, and that the brain is what we call plastic. That with hard work and effort, you can see dendrite growth, that something actually biologically changes about the way your brain is structured, how it works. Neurons that fired together, wired together, they become more efficient at conveying information. And that this is really what it means to get smarter. And that the way you can take control of that process is, again, to push yourself, to put in hard work, to really push the boundaries. And what we have found is that when students are oriented to this idea of malleable intelligence, particularly when they're presented with some evidence from neuroscience, and we found that it's a very powerful metaphor. We tell them things like the mind is like a muscle. The more you work it, the stronger it gets. That they are protected from stereotype threat. And what I want to show you here, I'm going to focus your attention on the first two pairs of bars and the last two pairs of bars. These are data from a study we did with middle school students in a low-income, mostly minority school district. And if you look at the last two bars in the anti-drug condition, they were mentored by college student mentors throughout the year in the idea that drugs are bad for you, they can really impact your schoolwork, don't do drugs. Anti-drug mentoring message. The other half of the participants, or another group, they were mentored but with a very different message. Instead of don't do drugs, they were mentored in the idea of malleable intelligence. They spent some time on the web investigating how, in fact, you can get smarter, reading articles about the plasticity of our brain, that we can create new synapses, stronger firings of our neurons through hard work and effort. At the end of the year, they took the statewide standardized test in math. This was the TOS test. So what you see here are their math TOS scores that are plotted. I want to point out that on the anti-drug condition, this is like our control condition, the district saw a gap in achievement between the scores of their female and male students that was pretty representative of what they had historically seen. However, for the participants who were mentored in the malleability of intelligence, everybody's scores went up. First of all, this is an intervention that sort of lifts everybody's achievement, but the gap in achievement between the males and the females was significantly reduced. Similarly, not only should we focus on changing the mindsets of the students, but we can also talk about the mindsets that are related to the purpose of the test. So here are data that come from, I think this was a science article. The first two bars really are representative of the non-threat and a threat pattern of performance. So in this study, 4 different groups of females took a math test. The first group was the non-threat condition. They were told that the test was just to look at problem-solving skills and that there were no gender differences on this test in the past. In the next condition, the second bar over, these participants were told that the purpose of the test was to see how smart they were in mathematics. And what we see is the standard stereotype threat pattern emerging. For 2 other groups, however, the test was presented in 2 different ways. In the third bar, the way the test was presented was that this test is a measure of an ability that has been linked to genes, that this is a test that can really tap into something that's inherent about you. In the fourth condition, they were told that the math test you're about to take has been shown to measure a skill that is driven by experience and hard work and effort. And as you can see, the genetics condition and the standard stereotype threat condition really model each other. And the condition in which the test was presented as something that could measure a skill that can be developed with hard work and effort really, again, modeled the non-threat condition. So how can we reduce stereotype threat? One is to encourage our students to adopt a malleable view of intelligence. Let them know that they can change how smart they are by really pushing themselves, by working out their brain. Give them metaphors for what that might look like. The mind is like a muscle. The harder you work it, the stronger it gets and the smarter you'll become. You can also reframe the nature of assessments. This is not something about measuring your intellect or measuring your future potential, but instead this is a measure of current skill level. Maybe the purpose of the test is to identify areas in which you need more help, rather than to identify areas in which you are not capable. And finally, if you think back to one of the first slides we talked about where Black participants completed those words with more race-relevant words, this has to do with identity salience. So when I'm about to take a test where I think that my performance is going to say something about my underlying intelligence, my identity really comes online. It's sort of in the forefront of my mind that I'm a woman, that I'm Black, and therefore all the stereotypes come along with it. If you think about the way our standardized testing works, one of the first things students do is that they fill out a demographic questionnaire. And these questionnaires ask exactly the types of questions that make their identity salient and therefore might put them at risk of stereotype threat. My colleagues have been working with some of these testing organizations to change this procedure. So for example, the Educational Testing Service is now working to change the procedures where they move those demographic questionnaires to the end of the test rather than the beginning of the test in the hopes of reducing female students and minority students' vulnerability to stereotype threat. I want to talk about another path through which negative stereotypes can undermine not just performance, but also representation in a domain. We have probably all have examples of very capable minority students, underrepresented groups, or females in math who are performing very well, but nevertheless choose to leave a discipline. And this is because the stereotypes raise not just questions about someone's ability, but also their belonging in the discipline. Whether or not you should be here. You know, should these positions be filled with women or should they be filled with men in science and in STEM disciplines? The question of belonging not only is something that might be a path through which the negative stereotype leads to these negative outcomes, but again, it could be a point of intervention as well. So what determines then, if we want to talk about belonging, what determines who belongs in a STEM program or career or in a STEM academic domain? I wonder if you have a few thoughts about that you could share with us in the chat function. So I'm seeing some people say things like role models, one's desire to be there, your own underlying interest or ability. Maybe you're getting encouragement from family and peers, your unique interests, your desires, the climate that they experience along the way. Maybe negative stereotypes are also driving who belongs. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. I'm going to move away from mindset and instead I want to talk about what does it mean to belong in an academic domain and what might that look like for participants or for students who have a lack of belonging. So sense of belonging has a long history in psychology. In fact, it's considered a fundamental human motive. We're motivated to feel like we belong with other social groups. We want to fit in. We want to be valued by others. Cues to a lack of social belonging, so whether or not I have friends or other people who I feel like are like me in academic domains, has been related to decreased motivation and achievement. So this is what I mean, and I think is a really great representation of what we mean by belonging. We have a cartoon here. I'll just go through it with us. And we have a female who's sitting in class and she's recognizing, she's looking around and she thinks, wait a minute, I'm the only female in this class. She starts to panic a little bit. It's okay. She's doing a little self-talk. Just be yourself. No pressure at all. I'm just, and she freaks out. Ah, I'm only representing all of womankind. She flops her head on the desk, clearly discouraged, wilted, deflated. And the caption says, Engineering 1, Womankind 0. And her peers think in their own minds, ditz and psycho. I'll unpack this for us. Usually when I give this presentation live, I ask for comments from the audience. If you want to reflect in the chat function, you're welcome to, but I'd like you to think about whether or not you think that this female feels like she really belongs in engineering or not. Does she feel valued by her peers? Does she feel respected by them? Do you think she feels accepted by those in her engineering environment, her community? What do you think her affect might be? Does she feel comfortable and relaxed, or is she feeling nervous and uptight and uncomfortable? Does she trust that her peers and maybe even the professors or the TAs in the class are going to be really committed to helping her learn? Do you think she's going to be the type of student who wants to be an active participant in this class? Is she going to take that risk and raise her hand and ask a question? All those good student behaviors that we know really lead to deep learning? I would say no, right? And this feeling of lack of belonging is not necessarily because of her lack of prior ability, her prior preparation, her interest in the domain, her dedication even to the domain. Instead, it's completely driven by the cues that she's getting from her environment that suggest that she might not belong here or isn't valued here or shouldn't be here simply because she's a woman. It's mostly men where I am. I'm trying to learn in this environment and it just does not feel comfortable to me. So this is the idea of belonging that I have been looking at in my work. And I conceptualize it as having 5 factors. Membership. How much do I feel like I'm a member of my academic domain? How accepted do I feel in my domain? What is my affect? Am I anxious and uptight and nervous, or am I comfortable and relaxed and at ease? Do I want to be an active participant in my class, or am I hoping to be a fly on the wall and hoping that nobody will notice me or call on me? And how much trust do I have in my instructors to really being committed to helping me learn? So when I talk about belonging in this presentation, this is really what I mean, this really rich, deep understanding of feelings of belonging, of being a member, being accepted, having positive affect, really wanting to be an active participant rather than being a fly on the wall, and having trust in your learning environment. We were curious about what female students' experiences of belonging might be within a calculus classroom. So we went into calculus classes and we asked them a number of questions about their feelings of belonging. We also asked them about their perceptions of stereotyping in their climate. So how much of their math learning climate was really infused with negative stereotypes about females. We asked them about the culture of talent that they perceived in their learning environment. And finally, we asked them what their intrinsic motivation was to continue studying math in the future. And we collected their math grades. So we're looking at in this study, what is the impact of the learning culture? This is not their own theory of intelligence or their own mindset, but what is the culture of talent that they might be perceiving? And what is the culture of stereotyping that they might be perceiving as well? So we asked them things like, people in my math class believe that other people have a certain amount of math intelligence and they can't really do much to change it. We also asked them a series of questions. People in my math class believe that females are not as good as males in math. We did a parallel study with middle school students as well. So although this represents a college sample, these particular data, we have very parallel data for a middle school sample. Okay, so what we found was that their perceptions of a culture of talent in their math classes and coupled with their perception of negative stereotypes within their learning environment undermined their feelings of belonging. When I perceived both a culture of talent and negative stereotypes, that made me feel less like a member, less accepted, made me have more negative affect, made me want to fade in the background and not really be noticed, and it decreased my trust in my peers and in my instructors. This is unfortunate because sense of belonging was positively related to the grades that they received at the end of the semester. The higher my grades were, the more positive relationship there was to my math grades. And the more positive relationship there was to my intrinsic motivation to continue taking math in the future. So what this says to us is a couple things. One, paying attention to students' feelings of belonging in academics is very important because it mediates almost completely the impact of their perceptions of that learning environment that they find themselves in on both their academic outcomes, their grades, and their motivation to persist in the future. So this gets at the idea of, what might lead somebody to leave a domain. It might be that their feelings of belonging are undermined because of their perceptions of the culture of talent and negative stereotypes. I just happened to catch a note in the chat function. Somebody asked, how was sense of belonging measured? It was measured using this scale right here. There were multiple items across all of these categories. We're getting at their sense of membership, how much they feel accepted, what is their affect, how much they want to be an active participant versus fade, and how much trust they had. So that's how that was measured. So I wanted to pose it to you. If feelings of belonging are very important to students, what do you think the foundations of that feeling of belonging might be? What is happening for students who feel a strong sense of belonging? What might be driving that? If you might just take a moment to answer that question in the chat function. So I'm seeing things like parental support, human nature, previous experience, whether or not they have a friend in the class, their network in their systems, whether or not they have teachers who care about their students, the class environment, prior success, teacher recognition, etc. Lots of different ideas here. We've moved beyond simply measuring whether or not participants feel a sense of belonging, but whether or not we can help them develop a strong sense of belonging. And we have some ideas about what that belonging might need to be rooted in. So you can imagine that students might feel that they really belong in STEM because they're doing well. I belong here because I'm getting good grades. This comes easy to me. In fact, I look at the guy sitting next to me and I see that he's getting A's on the test without hardly any effort at all. He's one of these people who doesn't have to study much but still gets the top grade in the class. These are the type of kids who really belong in STEM. That might be one way to base your belonging. And I think that a lot of students feel this way, that I belong in the fields in which I'm doing well. And that might sustain students for a period of time, but as we know, there always comes some point when that performance might falter. If you have students who are basing their feelings of belonging on ability and achievement, they are at risk of having a lack of belonging when they hit that wall, when they hit that point along their academic trajectory, when their performance might falter. Instead, we want to help students develop a foundation of belonging that's based on their effort and their engagement. So what's valued, what really marks somebody as a member of an academic community, instead of easy, high achievement, perhaps should be their level of engagement, participation, and effort that they put into the class. And we're curious as to whether or not this form of belonging might protect students from their experience of stereotype threat. So again, we're looking at belonging not just as an outcome of stereotypes that you might perceive, as well as an outcome of a culture of talent, but also now we're using it as a point of intervention. If I can encourage students to think of their feelings of belonging as based in their efforts and engagement rather than outcomes, might that be protective against stereotype threat? So we have conducted a study to test this. We've done this study again with both middle school students and college students. I'm going to show you the middle school student data here. And this is the design of the study. We had participants, we fostered either an effort-based belonging, which I'll show you how we do that in just one second, an ability-based belonging, or we had a control condition where we did not try to push around their feelings of belonging. We then told them that they were going to take a math test, either under stereotype threat or non-threat conditions, and we worked with both male and female participants. They completed a grade relevant and appropriate version of that math tutor that I showed you previously, where they answer math questions and then they're put into this math tutor where they can decide how much time to spend and how deeply to engage in the math tutor. And then they're again given that surprise retest. So in this study, we're looking at both how well they did at first test, what does their engagement in this math tutor look like, how much are they really taking advantage of that learning opportunity, and finally, what does their learning look like? Are they able to learn? So this is how we have been working with how we've manipulated one version of an intervention that you can use to push around feelings of belonging. So prior to taking the test, we had them read a scientific-based article that we wrote, and where we're really trying to push them into thinking of belonging as having a foundation either in effort or ability. So in the effort condition, they read an article that was entitled, How to Fit In and Belong to Math? Hard Work. Throughout the article, I've just pulled out some key phrases. What they read were things like the following. What really makes a math person is success through hard work. The students who put in effort are the ones who truly belong in math. And finally, we have this graph here that talks about who belongs in the math domain versus not. Students who passed the class with very little effort were less accepted by the math teachers than those who put a lot of work into the class. So again, here what we're trying to get students to adopt is the idea that their teachers, their professors are going to value them when they put in hard work and effort in the class. It's not necessarily the ones who get the easy A who are the most valued members of the math class, but rather it's the ones who do work hard to get those A's. That's what marks a math person, is engagement and effort with the content. Another group of participants got a very different message. They read a very similar article, at least in terms of how it looked, but with a very different message. So the title of this article was, How to Fit In and Belong to Math? Be a Natural. So here they learned things like, what makes a math person is success with little effort. These are the kids who easily get an A, who don't really have to try hard, but always seem to get that A in the class. The students who easily earn good grades are the ones who truly belong in math. And students who worked hard were less accepted by the math teachers than were those who were able to pass the class easily. So then again, our basic research question here is if we're pushing belonging around and having it really being oriented either on ability or hard work and effort, can that protect them from the negative stereotype threat that they're going to experience while they're solving these math problems? So again, after they engaged in this belonging manipulation, they solved math problems, they were put into the math tutor. We're looking at how many steps they're clicking on, how many mores they're clicking on, how much time overall they're spending in this engagement piece of their learning. So the data are, I could probably talk for an hour about this study alone, so I'm just going to highlight the real take-home messages for this study. And what we have found is that our belonging messages was very effective. So for those in the effort-based belonging condition, they actually did spend more time and clicked on more steps and went deeper into the tutor than did participants in the other two conditions, being the control condition or the achievement-based belonging condition. So encouraging your students to understand that what's valued in your classrooms is hard work and effort and engagement and really participating will actually make is related to them putting in more effort in their learning opportunities. We also, I think my animations did not work. Let me see. Sorry, my animations didn't work, so I'm going to unpack this for us. So let's look at the yellow bars first. We found a three-way interaction between males and females in the threat and the non-threat condition and across belonging conditions. So this is a bit complicated, but I will unpack it for us. The first thing I want to draw your attention to are the the yellow bars are control conditions. So these are people who got no belonging message whatsoever. And you can see that the females in the stereotype threat condition engaged less in that learning opportunity than did females in the non-threat condition. If we shift now to the red bars, when participants were encouraged to base their belonging on hard work and effort, that the people in the math class who are really valued and who belong are the ones who put in hard work and effort in order to get that A, those were the people who actually engaged more in their learning. And it helped them sort of reconstrue this threat condition, this idea that they were going to take this test and this test was going to indicate their underlying ability, that actually encouraged them, it challenged them to put in more effort into the test. So the take-home message here is that basing belonging on hard work and effort leads overall to more engagement in a learning opportunity, but more importantly, or interestingly, it helps change that threat experience for the female participants into more of a challenge. If I know that what really matters to my instructors is my engagement, even when I'm under stereotype threat, I'm still going to put in hard work, I'm still going to put in effort. Okay, so what we have learned from this study is that stereotype threat can undermine engagement in learning. However, if you encourage students to base their belonging on hard work and effort, that can protect against these negative stereotype threat effects. It can lead to higher engagement in their learning opportunities and ultimately then to better learning and higher outcomes. So people have been typing in their chat function that we really need to pay attention to both instructors and also parents. I don't have parent data to show you today, but I do have some data about teachers and what role they may play in shaping mindsets. The 2 studies ago, I talked about the importance of students' perception of their learning environment. Whether that learning environment conveyed a culture of talent or not had a lot to do with whether or not they felt like they belonged in that environment, in that domain, and ultimately impacted their grades and their intrinsic motivation. So what role might teachers play in shaping this culture? So I would like you to imagine that you are a CTE instructor and you've just returned an exam to your students. You decide to speak with a particular student who did not do very well on the exam. And I would like you to indicate how likely you would be to maybe make them feel better about their performance. You know, we don't want our students to have low self-esteem or to feel bad about themselves, and how likely you might be to suggest that they do things like work with a tutor or seek out extra help. So I'll just give 1 minute for that. So I'm seeing people respond that they would likely do both, that they would comfort them about their poor performance, but they might also give them strategies to do moving forward. So I want to talk to you about some data we have where we looked at how teachers might think about either malleable or fixed intelligence and how that might drive their pedagogical practices in the face of a poorly performing student. So in this study, we had participants come in and we presented them with a hypothetical student who had performed poorly, and we asked them, we told them, listen, in this study, I'd like you to imagine that you are a math teacher, just like I asked you to do, and going to ask you to indicate how likely you would be to endorse a host of pedagogical practices that you'll be reading through. Because you're not a teacher, you don't come from the education field, we'd like to give you some background in educational theory first. This is the way we set up our studies. That background really provided the manipulation in the study. Half of the participants read a very compelling article talking about the malleability of intelligence, that math intelligence is not fixed, it's actually rooted in hard work and effort and the environment that students find themselves in, and that you can increase how smart you are. The other half of the participants, however, read about the math gene. We told them that through twin studies, there's evidence that math intelligence is in fact connected to genes, and that intrinsic ability is one of the better predictors of math success. Our question was whether or not teachers' own views about the nature of intelligence as either being fixed or malleable might subtly impact the actual strategies that they use in their classrooms. If you ask a teacher, do you think students can learn? We all say, yes, of course, all students can learn. It's up to hard work and effort. But what we have learned through careful experimentation is that when teachers are oriented towards one view or the other, whether or not they explicitly state it, can impact their how they respond to their students. So this is what we found. When participants were oriented towards this fixed view of math intelligence, and then they were asked, what would you do for a struggling student? They were more likely to endorse teaching practices that actually conveyed that fixed view. They were likely to comfort them for their poor performance. They gave them less opportunities to work on challenging problems, and they de-emphasized the role of effort in students' outcomes. So I've just shown you one example here. They were significantly more likely to endorse statements like, I would tell the student that it's okay, not everybody can be math people. Some people are math people and some people aren't. You should maybe focus on your successes in other domains. You're really good and you're doing really well in English, for example. So that's like that comfort message. However, for the participants who were oriented towards this incremental view, they were more likely to endorse practices that might actually convey the idea that they think of intelligence as malleable. They were likely to implicate the student's own efforts or lack thereof in their poor performance. They were more likely to provide them with challenging math problems as opposed to pulling back from providing challenge to the students. And they were less likely to provide that comfort-based response. So the take-home message here is that teachers' own underlying theories of intelligence are important predictors of what they might do moving forward with a struggling student. We then took that whole host of pedagogical practices and put it into like a scenario, had a new group of participants come in, and we said, imagine now you are a student and you have done poorly on a math test. Your teacher comes to you to talk to you about your performance, and this is what they say. In one condition, participants heard the following. I know you are a talented student in general, but it's not the case that everybody's a math person. You need to remember how great you're doing in other subjects. You know, I'm going to call on you less in class because I don't want to embarrass you, and I'm going to give you some easier math tests to help you along the way. The other half of the participants got more of a strategy-based feedback. I know you're a talented student in general, but you need to change your study strategies. You should consider working with a tutor. I'm actually going to call on you more in class. I'm going to give you very challenging math problems to work on. After getting these two different orientations of feedback, which again came from the very types of pedagogical practices that were endorsed in our previous study by either the entity or the incremental oriented teachers, we asked students, how much do you think your teacher thinks of intelligence as either fixed or malleable? And what we found is that when students are comforted for their poor performance, they actually perceive their teachers as having a fixed mindset about math intelligence. When their teachers give them more strategy-oriented feedback, they're less likely to think of their teachers as holding a fixed view and more likely to think of their teachers as holding a malleable view. We've asked them follow-up questions about how much do you, how motivated are you in this class? How invested are you in this class? And what are your expectations for your own success? And again, we found significant differences between those who received either the comforting feedback or the strategy-based feedback. Participants who got that comfort feedback, which was rooted in what we saw entity-oriented teachers endorsing, had lower expectations for themselves, were less motivated, and had lower investment in their course. Those who received the strategy feedback had much higher expectations of themselves, were more motivated, and had higher investment. So what we are learning through a whole host of studies is that stereotype thread, again, can undermine performance and it can get in the way of learning, but we can help students overcome stereotype threat by changing both their mindsets as well as our own mindsets about what is the nature of intelligence. Entity messages in the learning environment that are conveyed perhaps by the teacher or by cues that they're getting from other students can reduce their sense of belonging, which in turn can undermine their achievement and their retention in the domain. And this is particularly true in the face of stereotypes. However, incremental messages in the learning environment You can do it through hard work and effort, and let's change our strategies if we're not doing well. Those types of messages can help foster a hearty sense of belonging for students, which can then lead to high achievement and sustained interest and intrinsic motivation in the domain. And this is true even when stereotypes are present. So educators then who are emphasizing effort as opposed to ability and high achievement as the key determination of what really marks a student as being valued and accepted and really relevant to the classroom can promote more learning engagement for underrepresented students and for females in STEM. It can also help reduce the impact of stereotype threat and ultimately might do something to erode the culture of talent that is so pervasive in the STEM domains. Over time, this higher engagement could eventually lead to higher learning and achievement. That concludes sort of the data portion of my talk, and I have a few more moments here. I'm not sure how many of these scenarios we will have time to get through, but I'd like for you to either work with somebody that you're sitting with or engage in the chat function and think about the information that we talked about today in this presentation and apply it to these scenarios that I've created. So imagine that you are presenting new information in your course. It's inherently difficult, and you notice that many of your students are confused. What ideas might you convey as you're presenting this new difficult information? I'm going to give just a few moments, and then I'll share my thoughts as well. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of typing about helping students break down the content into smaller, more digestible chunks. Perhaps use the jigsaw classroom method. If you're not familiar with that, I would encourage you to go look at Elliot Aronson's work on the jigsaw classroom. I think he even has a website with resources that are very, very useful and relevant. And I'm going to move on now to my suggestions here. These are all great, and I'm not suggesting that what I have to say is the only thing, but I just am taking the lens through stereotype thread and belonging and mindsets. So here's one thing I might do. I might really try to take this opportunity to create an incremental-oriented classroom rather than an entity-oriented classroom. Embrace the idea that the material is hard. Dispel the myths about STEM, for example. Just because material is hard does not mean that you don't have to work hard at it. In fact, that is a cue perhaps that you do have to really struggle, change your strategies, break it down into smaller, more digestible bits. All those things that you all were typing in the chat functions can be thought about as particular strategies that the students should use. Help them reframe the idea that their struggle has anything to do with their underlying ability, but instead is a cue to let's take a different approach. Emphasize the idea that confusion is actually a normal state of learning, and that when students feel confused, they should not interpret this as a sign that they're not capable, but rather that this is their opportunity. This is the moment when they might be actually growing a new dendrite. I know that that's not the actual biological way that it happens, but it's a nice metaphor. I often tell my students, you know, when you're struggling really hard on content and you just feel like your brain is hurting, you can use the metaphor of, I must have just grown a new dendrite. That's why my brain hurts so much right now, because this is so difficult to work on. So dendrite growth is what comes out of hard work and confusion and really struggling on problems. So the fact that we're struggling is good for us in some way, because it means that we're learning something new. This is where, this is my opportunity to increase my intelligence. when I work with educators and I give presentations to school districts and to math departments, they often ask me, how can I incorporate this language into my regular classroom lesson? Because it seems so disparate. And this is exactly how you do it. When you notice that students are struggling, you take this opportunity to talk about the malleable nature of the brain, that the brain is plastic, that we're growing new dendrites, we're making stronger neural connections, and that through this struggle process is how I can help solidify and make my neural functioning more efficient. I would also talk about or take this opportunity to talk to students about what it means to belong in this classroom. That it's not just the students who might be getting it pretty easily, because students are very good at picking up on that. I may be struggling, my group may be struggling, but I'm noticing that somebody across the classroom or the group right next to me is having an easier time. This is your opportunity to really make those students who are struggling, who are working hard, feel like they're valued. Talk to them about how their struggles actually can lead to deeper and greater understanding for the class as a whole. Everybody can contribute, even if you're confused. Sometimes the most confused student who asks a question can help other confused students, or can give an opportunity for instructors to go a little bit deeper or to explain the concept in a new way that can lead to greater learning. So all students are valued. The students who are just sitting there powering through the materials, that might be great for them, but they're not operating in that zone of proximal development, and it's really the students who are working hard who are the ones who are valued. So those are two takeaways that I would say, is that to use struggle and difficulty in your instructional time as an opportunity to talk about the idea that intelligence is malleable, and to talk about the idea that belonging is determined by engagement and contributions to the classroom culture, not just easy achievement. Freda, I'm not sure if we have time for one more or if you would like to wrap up. Freda? Well, I don't hear from Freda right now. She might be trying to get on at the moment, so I will just go ahead and do another one if you would like. Okay. A similar scenario, but instead of presenting a lesson, you we're engaging now with an individual student. You have a student. How might your responses change if this is her worst subject and she's performing poorly? Okay, people are typing really great responses here. I'm just going to jump right into mine because I know that we are running short on time. Again, this is another opportunity to convey an incremental view of intelligence. You can reassure the student that even if this is her best subject and she did poorly, this does not mean that they aren't smart. So many students have come to me. I used to come from the math world. In fact, I was a math PhD student before I switched to psychology, and I used to teach calculus. And my students would say to me, I used to be smart in math, and I don't know what happened. I guess I'm not anymore. I've hit my wall. I guess I was smart up to a certain point, but now I'm not. Very often students, especially within STEM domains, take their first instance of struggle and failure as a cue to flee. This must mean that I'm not smart. This must mean I'm not capable. It could partly be due to their own underlying theory of intelligence, but I would argue that it has more to do with the culture of talent that exists in these domains, and that we have to work extra hard to dispel that culture and to reshape the culture. reframe poor performance. It doesn't mean you're not smart. It just means either that you didn't master the material, or you had a bad day, or the material was presented in a way that was confusing to you. I wasn't able to show these data, but I would argue that for particularly older students, in college at least, that to talk to them about the stereotype threat construct, that has been shown to alleviate stereotype threat effects. So maybe you were really anxious during the test. Did you know that there's this construct called stereotype threat that can increase your anxiety? It can pull your attention away from the task at hand. It can undermine your working memory so that you have less resources to bring to the task. And that might be why you didn't do well on this exam. Not because you're not smart or not because you're not capable, but because you suffered from stereotype threat in this situation. Teaching students about stereotype threat can reduce their vulnerability to it because it gives them a different attribution for their struggles. Instead of making the attribution that, I guess I'm not smart anymore, it can be, oh, that must have been that stereotype threat thing that my teacher talked to me about. Also reassure them that one poor performance does not mean that you won't be able to perform well in the future. And again, this is an opportunity to emphasize effective effort. This effort message is a tricky thing, and I'd like to spend just 2 minutes talking about it. It can actually backfire to tell students, you need to try harder, because students will say to you, I did try hard. I tried so hard. I studied so long. I did my homework and I still didn't do well. So when my students come to me and talk about their struggles, the first thing I ask them, I spend some time with them and I have them tell me, what did you do? How did you study? Exactly, how did you go through those homework problems? Clearly what you're doing now is not the right way to go about studying this content. Let's make some changes. Study differently, ask questions in class, get extra help, create a study group, come to office hours, make flashcards of problems, whatever it might be and what's relevant for your domain. It's not just trying harder, because that can be very, very demoralizing to students who feel like they are trying harder, but to try harder in a more effective way. So it's not just more effort, but it's more effective effort. And also, it's very important to continue giving these students hard, challenging math problems or STEM problems or whatever the content might be. To back off on the challenge of the problem sends the message to them that you don't think they're capable. It sends the message, that comfort message that we saw earlier, that you don't think they're going to be capable of doing this, and it might actually convey that fixed view of intelligence. It can ultimately undermine motivation and interest and persistence in the domain. Yes. Hi, Freda. Are we over?
Catherine, this is Freda, and I think we need to, I think that we can move along a little bit here, and we have
Do you
some
want me to do the
questions.
key takeaways?
So let's just sort of flip through these.
Great. So the key
we can
takeaways
let
from
them,
today's talk, again,
and then we'll do
are
a
the
few
following.
questions.
Stereotype threat can undermine
Thank you.
both performance and learning. It is not just a laboratory phenomena, but it's relevant to real classroom situations. It's relevant to students at all different levels of schooling, both in college and in high school, and as low down as middle school as well. Reducing stereotype threat can increase a focus on learning and engagement, and can ultimately lead to higher achievement. One way that we can help reduce stereotype threat is to encourage effort-based belonging as opposed to ability-based belonging, helping students feel like they belong and that they're valued, they're wanted in this academic domain because of the engagement and what they contribute to the classroom can go a long way. And finally, recall that teachers' own mindsets about intelligence can seep into their pedagogical practices, which students then pick up on and respond to, so that teachers' own theories of intelligence can impact both how they teach and their students' mindsets about learning and achievement. The strategies then that we might use to reduce stereotype threat in our STEM classrooms are to create incremental oriented classrooms, to foster a sense of belonging for all students based on effort and engagement, and to take opportunities to reinforce this idea that intelligence is malleable and to point out and be explicit about what effective effort in your domain might look like. Finally, to reassure students that they are all valued members of your classroom. Everyone's perspectives are valued and their contributions are really what marks them as a valued member in your learning environment. Everyone's learning can benefit from everyone else's participation. I have a whole host of graduate students, undergraduate students, and other colleagues to acknowledge. I'd like to orient you to reducingstereotypethreat.org. It's a website that I have been involved in. The website, I will tell you, is a bit out of date. We're working on updating it, but new research is coming out every day. But if you're looking for a place to go to get some foundational knowledge, this is a great resource. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the National Science Foundation, multiple grants that I and my colleagues have received that have supported this work. Questions? Okay.
Fred, if you're speaking, we can't hear you. Yes.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Hello? Okay. Here are the questions. Why didn't you address the attribution condition in the TAAS mentoring experiment?
Yes, so
what was that?
yes, absolutely.
It eliminated
so
the gap in
mentoring
achievement
study
between
that I
males and
showed you,
females.
where we mentored
So
the middle
maybe
school
you could
students.
answer.
There were actually 4 different conditions in that study. The anti-drug condition, the malleable condition, those were the 2 I talked about. And then we had an attributions condition, which was a little bit more complicated message. This was the idea that we were giving them attributions for their struggles that they could make that would be different than attributing their struggles to their own poor performance. That condition was also very beneficial. It had some creeping into it of that malleable message. That's why I didn't discuss it. I really just wanted to keep those data clean because that attribution message was a little bit messy. But if you're interested in knowing more, I'd be happy to share it.
Okay, the next question. The next question is from Brian. Can the instructor change the mindset of the entire classroom?
Absolutely,
and he said,
yes.
I think
the
yes.
instructor has
What's
a
your
lot
answer?
to do about either orienting their students toward an entity mindset, which I think is very easy for them to do, just simply saying things like, oh, that's an elegant solution. Oh, you know, the brilliance and the genius. All these things are part of our vernacular when we talk about STEM. Reframing that and to break down those misconceptions about who our academic heroes are in STEM can go a long way towards that. Showing their own struggles, really modeling real problem solving, not just solutions to problems, can also help undo that. And I think to be very explicit about what is the nature of intelligence is important as well. In my own classes, I talk about the neuroscience piece because students find it very compelling.
Thank you. This is from Laura. What was the actual learning results from your study? So they engaged more in bought-in via effort, belonging.
That's true. Effort doesn't
but did they
always
also
mean that
learn
they have
more?
learned.
Effort doesn't always mean they have
learning
learned.
Data, but what we're finding is that the effort-based message, we're putting it into a structural equation model to look at the path from actual engagement to learning. If you saw at the very beginning, that first slide was that multivariate effect. If you look carefully, what we're finding here is that that effort-based message impacts both first performance, engagement, and learning, all 3. I just focused on the engagement piece.
Thank you. Gretal said, what articles were used to talk about malleability?
So in most of my work, the intervention work that I do, these are resources that I've created. If you want some resources that you can go to, I'd really direct you to Neuroscience for Kids. If you just Google Neuroscience for Kids, you'll find a really useful website. Although it says for kids, it's got information that I think is that I use with my college students. In fact, it's a great place to go. Frontline is another great website you can go to. They have um, more resources about the malleability of intelligence, the plasticity of the brain. I saw somebody made a comment that it might not be dendrite growth per se, but it's about strengthening neural connections. These are all pieces of information that you could use. And if you email me, I'd be happy to share some of those resources.
And I would state that her email is in the resource handout that you can download under Documents above the chat function.
Parents.
This is
I
from Mary.
love that
Are
somebody
findings
asked me the
comparable
question
for
on
parents?
So I am beginning to do some studies with parents. There's a lot of data coming from the gender research talking about the impact of parents' own views, parents' own expectations for their girls versus their boys' achievement. But there has been little work on actually intervening with parents to help them adopt a more malleable view. I really think of this as the trifecta that you have to incorporate. You have to work with students. You have to make sure teachers also are thinking of intelligence as malleable, but you also need to have a parent outreach. I offer parent outreach seminars and components to the work I do with school districts. What I have found is that I'm a parent, and I understand we're all very busy people, so it's hard to reach that population, but it's a very important population to have. You can have a student who goes to their classroom and might be learning and having a very incremental oriented view, but when they come home, they might be getting the message, your dad and I weren't good in math either, it's okay, it's not in our genes. And I think that's very much a message that parents give. It's rooted in a deep place of love. They're trying to comfort their child for the struggles that they're having so that they don't feel bad. But ultimately, they're sending the message that it's okay. It's all right. You know, it's not part of our genes, so it's not important and it's not something you have to work at.
Okay, with the strategy feedback, I think students would push back and shut down. Is that true?
So those data were
when
from
you
an
had the strategy
experimental
feedback.
study asking participants to imagine that this is the feedback they're getting from teachers. But there is other work showing that, and you can look at programs across the country. Uri Treisman's Emerging Scholars model, for example, I think is a good example of how some of this stuff has found its way into real classrooms. When you hold students, minority students, female students to high standards, you give them challenging content to work on, and you provide the supports that they need to get there with the unfaltering belief that you have faith in them, that they can learn, that they can improve. What data from these types of programs is showing is that the gap in achievement between the minority students and the white students or the Asian students is significantly reduced, and you get many more students pursuing the domain. So I would say they don't push back. They actually want to be challenged, but they want to be challenged in a way that in which they also feel supported.
This is from Linda.
Absolutely.
It says,
I'd be
Dr.
happy to
Good,
work
do
with
you
your
present
group if you'd
workshops
like
to
to
groups
reach
of
out.
educators? Okay, and you can find her email address on the resource document. Thank you. Those are all the questions, and I'm going to just do my my ending stuff. You can stay on, Catherine, if you want to. But here we go. I just want to remind people that NAEP has products and services, and they can also help provide workshops in the various areas that we talked about today. Professional development, we have a PDI in April and hope people can attend. We have consulting services. We have a career toolkit, so please check those out. And I just want to say thank you to Catherine. It was an excellent presentation. You know how to really get us engaged and learn a lot about the content, so I thank you very much. And thank Greg Nagy, who is taking care of all the technical problems that we have or setting us up, so thank you, Greg. I'd also like to encourage people to join our virtual learning community and view any of the archived webinars at the stemequitypipeline.org. I thank everyone for participating, and I know that many people have gotten off. We still have people on. Please complete the survey question that's here, and I'm going to move us to a closing slide so that you can download that. And Greg, you might pop that up for
Okay, this is
people.
Greg. I'm going to hit a button now, and this
Thank
should
you.
open a survey in another tab in your browser. It works for most people. If it doesn't work for you, if you click on where it says please complete a quick survey for a certificate of participation, you'll see next to the Browse To button the URL that you can use. I will also copy and paste it into the chat. If you don't have time for it now, I will be emailing this to everyone that registered as well. And as Freda said, remember, if you get to the second page and you finish filling it all out, you'll get a certificate of completion as soon as you finish it. Anything else, Freda?
Just a second. Okay, Catherine, many people have asked if they could have the PowerPoint, and I didn't ask permission from you to be able to share that. And so if I can,
Sure.
I will share it, but it would be on our stemequitypipeline.org site. So we can talk about that later. Okay. Thank you very much. And once you have completed your survey, you can sign off. If you need any help, just type in the chat function and Greg can help you with the survey if you need help. But you can see a link right here.